Plywood is crazy expensive these days, and working with plywood has a lot of unique challenges that, if you don't handle properly, could end up ruining your project and could even mean heading back to that home center to buy a whole new sheet. No pressure, right? Well, in this video, I'm going to go over what I think are the 5 most common and costly plywood mistakes and show you how to avoid those so that you can get the most out of your gold. Plywood. So let's start with the first mistake that you can make with your plywood, and this one happens before you even make your first cut. If you've ever walked down the plywood aisle of your local big box store, you've probably seen at least one horribly bowed piece of plywood sitting right on the top of the stack. The most common reason for plywood to go all potato chip on you is moisture, when one side of the plywood gets wet and the other one stays dry. And that first sheet of plywood on top of the stack, that's like the forbidden fruit of woodworking. It always has the greatest exposure to the elements. It could get rained on during transport, or the home center could just have a leaky roof. And besides moisture, the top sheet also tends to be a lot more dirty and dusty, more likely to have scratch marks, and also have its edges damaged by the banding that holds the stack of plywood together. So just avoid that sheet altogether, set it to the side, and grab one of the ones below it. But just know, you're not out of the woods yet. Once you get your plywood home, there's a couple things you should avoid doing before you're ready to cut your sheet into parts. First, you should avoid laying plywood directly down onto a concrete floor. That's because concrete is highly porous and moisture from the ground below is going to wick right up into that plywood. Now, how long that's going to take really depends on how much moisture is present, but I wouldn't leave it laying directly on the ground for more than a day or two. Now, if you just have no choice but to lay your plywood flat, buy a piece of pink foam insulation to set it on. Not only is the foam a barrier to moisture, but it's also going to protect the face of the plywood from getting scratches, and it also has another really good use, which I'm going to talk about later in the video. A better option is to store your plywood on its edge, but not the short edge. If you stack your sheet vertically like this and lean it against a wall, the plywood is naturally going to begin to bow in the middle, and if left that way for long enough, it's going to develop a bit of a memory, and that bow is going to become permanent. I find it's better to store that plywood along its long edge. It's going to be a lot less flexible this way. And if you're going to store it for more than a week or so, I think it's a good idea to put something underneath those edges to keep those off the concrete as well. Another way to keep plywood from bowing on you is to use versions that don't have solid wood cores. Options like MDF or Combi Core are going to be a lot more stable because they don't have that grain like solid wood does. And even though MDF is susceptible to moisture, it's more of a swelling of the material versus warping like a Pringle. Now, if you've done all this and you still notice that you got a little bow in your plywood, this is definitely not the end of the world. If you're cutting your plywood into a bunch of smaller parts, like for a cabinet, chances are that slight bow is not going to translate through to the smaller parts because every time you cut your plywood down, that degree of bow is cut in half. So if you're trying to plan the cuts for all your parts, the bigger the bow in the plywood, the smaller the parts you want to try to cut out of that sheet. The most common issue people run into with plywood is making cuts that look like they were made using an angry beaver. Nothing ruins the look of a plywood project faster than mangled, chipped up edges. And what makes this issue trickier than others is that there can be more than one reason why this can happen, so I'll try to address those one by one. The first and probably most important thing is to check that you're using the right saw blade for this type of cut. It doesn't matter if you're using a table saw, track saw, or circular saw, it's the blade, not the saw, that matters the most. Low tooth count ripping blades are the worst for this kind of cut. Their tooth geometry is designed for cutting down the length of solid wood. The flat tooth design and low tooth count is extremely efficient for rip cuts, but absolutely terrible for cross cuts. Medium tooth count all-purpose blades are designed to do both rip and cross cuts, but they're kind of like a jack-of-all-trades blade, meaning they're kind of good at both jobs, but not really excellent at either one. What you should use is a high tooth count crosscut blade. For table saws, this is usually an 80-tooth blade and a 60-tooth blade for circular saws. The geometry of the teeth are designed to create shearing cuts, kind of like a pair of scissors cutting paper, which is perfect for getting super crisp, clean plywood cuts. So just choosing the right saw blade is going to get you like 90% of the way to clean cuts on plywood, but there are 2 other tricks that you can stack on top of that to virtually guarantee success. The first is choosing which side faces up when you're making your cuts, and this can be a little confusing because it all depends on which type of saw you're using. The thing you should always remember is that tear out's going to happen whenever the saw blade is exiting the wood. On a table saw, the blade is spinning towards the user, it enters the wood from the top and exits at the bottom. So on a table saw, you always want your good face or your show face pointing up. But with a circular saw or a track saw, the blade enters at the bottom and exits at the top. So when using these saws, make sure your show face is on the bottom. The third way to prevent tear out is to back up your cut on 3 sides. Now, when you're cutting plywood, you're cutting 4 different faces of the material. The front face or the leading edge doesn't need any protection because it already has material behind it backing up the cut. But the other 3 sides could use some help. One great trick to use is to cover your cut lines with painter's tape. And that's because that tape is going to replace the veneer as the topmost layer, supporting it and keeping the blade from tearing it out. A second form of backup is to use a zero clearance throat plate for your table saw. Your table saw's stock throat plate is going to be much wider than the blade itself. And that's going to leave all this unsupported gap on both sides. A zero clearance plate is made by using a blank plate like this, turning on your saw and raising the blade through the plate. Now that throat plate fully supports your workpiece right up to the cutting edge. If you're using a circular saw or a track saw, the equivalent to this is going to be like that splinter guard that's on your guide rail, or using a jig like this with your circular saw. That's going to allow you to make your cut right against this edge, backing up that cut as the blade exits the wood. The last thing to do is to provide some support on the back side of that cut, and that's the side that's going to most easily tear out. The painter's tape still works really well in this situation, but a better option is to use a crosscut sled or a miter gauge with a board attached to back that cut up. In fact, a crosscut sled has 2 forms of backup built right in. There's zero clearance on the bottom edge and have a fence fully supporting the back side of the cut. So choosing the right blade, right face direction, and supporting that cut on 3 sides, that's basically the secret sauce to getting clean, crisp cuts on plywood. Making a boneheaded mistake and ruining an expensive piece of plywood is not good. Using public Wi-Fi without a VPN, also not good. Look, surfing public Wi-Fi is like trying to freehand a cut that has to be absolutely dead straight, except in this case, you're not gonna ruin a sheet of plywood, you're gonna offer up your personal information for anyone willing to look for it. I don't want that happening to me or anyone else, which is why you need a VPN like Surfshark, the sponsor of this video. Surfshark is an app or a browser extension that protects your activity online. And it's not just all about security. It's a fact that online sellers can and do change their pricing based on where your device says you are. Flights, hotels, even software can all change, but with Surfshark, you can swap your location and check prices from different places and sometimes save a boatload of money. You can also access shows and content on different streaming services not available in your country, and you can even get around paywalls of famous news sites. And you only need 1 subscription to protect all the devices in your household. So just go to surfshark.com/MWA and use promo code MWA at checkout to get an extra 4 months for free. And look, if you don't find it valuable, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So thank you to Surfshark for protecting me and for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to plywood mistake number 3. Another common mistake that can ruin your plywood is when you're assembling it, specifically the joinery. So I'm going to go over the 3 most common joinery methods used with plywood and how you can screw each one up. Probably the easiest and most common joint is a butt joint fastened together with screws. But this is also the easiest way to ruin your joint. And that's because plywood is made of layers of wood and glue at right angles, which is what gives plywood its strength and stability. But unfortunately, it can also be its biggest weakness if you try to screw right into those layers. And that's because the screw acts like a wedge and pries those layers apart. But you can avoid that entirely if you remember to drill pilot holes before screwing into the edge of any plywood. Drilling that pilot hole removes just enough material that the screw can no longer act like a wedge, and you can take this step further by using a countersink bit, which is going to drill that pilot hole but also add a countersink at the same time so that the screw can sit below the surface of the wood. Another version of this joint is using pocket screws. Now with pocket screws, you can completely avoid drilling into the edge of that plywood, instead entering at an angle from one face into the face of the other part. Now, there's a number of ways that you can still screw up this joint. You can forget to change the settings on the jig, for example, to match your workpiece, or you can accidentally use the wrong screw size for the joint and blow right through the other side. But the biggest mistake is putting the pocket holes on the wrong side of the joint. In order to get the strongest possible joint, your pocket screws should be angled into the joint from this direction. Reversing this causes the screw to angle out towards the edge, which can weaken the joint. Now, this is a mistake even I've made. In fact, I did this exact same thing in the most popular video in the history of my channel. Talk about epic screw-ups. But luckily for me, that didn't turn out to be a very big deal at all. Nothing disastrous happened, and I know that because, well, that project is right behind me. I've been using it as my miter saw station for the last 5 years. And look, the only reason I even mention this is because if you find yourself making this same mistake, don't panic and think that you've got to redo everything, because in a lot of real world situations, especially ones where those joints don't really bear any structural load, this whole dogma about which way to put your pocket holes is just way overblown. Now, should you install them the right way when you can? Yes, absolutely. But if you screw up and that didn't happen, are you going to lose sleep over that? I don't really think you have to. Another popular method for joining plywood is using rabbets and dados, which allow one part to nest inside the other one like this. Add some glue and you have a really strong joint. But the strength of this joint relies entirely on the fit. The common mistake people make is thinking, well, this is 3/4 inch plywood, so I'll just use a 3/4 inch plywood bit. Well, this is in fact not 3/4 of an inch. If this joint is loose fitting, it's gonna flop around and be basically useless. The better way to cut this is using a table saw and then sneaking up on the perfect fit. Just keep making passes and checking the fit until the joint comes together with some resistance, but not too much force. Another way to make this cut is to use router bits that are actually undersized for plywood. They usually come in a set of 3 for 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch plywood, and that allows you to make these cuts in one shot versus doing it cut by cut on the table saw. Now, I've used these bits for years and they work really well, but sometimes plywood can have irregular thicknesses and these joints can be a little bit tighter than they really should be, sometimes just too tight. So the most foolproof way to do this is definitely at the table saw. These bits do make things a lot faster, but you could run into the rare instance where that joint is just too tight and you're gonna have to go to the table saw anyways to loosen that up. All right, so this next mistake is one that you may not even realize you're making until your project is fully assembled and...
Now that's one fine looking... Why doesn't mine look like that?
Plywood is the material of cabinets and built-ins, and cabinets are just a bunch of rectangles fastened together. And here's my method for making sure all my parts are square. And I hope this isn't going to be too confusing, but I'm going to be hopping back and forth between my table saw, track saw, and circular saw to show you how to do this method no matter which one of those tools you have. The first step is making a straight cut. And this is exactly what a track saw was designed to do the best. But if you don't have one, that's okay. A circular saw with a guide or a straight edge is going to work with just a little more effort. Using a homemade guide like this is just going to take a little more concentration because the saw is not fixed to anything, so you can wander off your guide and your cut's going to be not quite straight. Another way is to use one of these cheap jigs from Craig that ride along the outside edge and help me get that straight cut. But whichever method you use, just make sure that that initial cut is 1/4 to 1/2 inch wider than the final dimension needs to be. And the reason for that is because we do need to get rid of that factory edge. I don't want to just get rid of this factory edge. I want to make this edge parallel to this edge. So if you have a table saw, put the known trusted edge that you cut earlier against the fence and then rip off that factory edge. Or you can use the Craig jig again the same way, just put the guide against the straight edge that you cut the first time. And this is going to act like your fence on the table saw, ensuring that you get a perfectly parallel cut. All right, well, we've got half the work done. These two edges are now parallel. Now we need to take those and make them square to the ends. So if you made one of those jigs for your circular saw, just go ahead and tack on a scrap piece of material to the end of the guide like this, using a square to ensure it's, well, square. Now you can just reference off the edge of the plywood and get your square cut. The track saw version of this is to use a rail square. These just clamp onto the guide rail like this, and now you can make the exact same square cut. And the third method to make this cut is to use a crosscut sled at the table saw. And as I mentioned earlier, you get the added benefit of those zero clearance cuts that help you get those crispy crisp edges. Now to square up the other end, just flip the panel over, leaving the same reference edge against the fence, and that's going to make sure that both ends are square to the same edge. Or you can go back and repeat the last step with your track saw or your circular saw. All right, now for the final test. You just need to go and check all 4 of your corners, and you can use a fancy square if you want to check each one individually, or a much cheaper and maybe faster way to do it is to just measure from corner to corner using a tape measure. Begin by measuring one corner to the opposite corner and note that measurement. Then check the opposite corners. If the measurement is exactly the same, congratulations, your panel is square. The next mistake I want to talk about is maybe the most tragic one on the whole list, and that's because it's caused by people doing something that's completely unnecessary to begin with. Plywood is famous for having very thin veneer layers, which can make them super easy to burn through with a sander. If you linger a little too long in one area or hang out near the edges too much, that veneer layer can disappear in a flash. The sad part about this whole thing is you're probably using sandpaper that's way too aggressive, and that's because most cabinet grade plywood comes from the factory already sanded to 180 grit. Which means you shouldn't have to use anything more aggressive than that, and in most cases, you can begin sanding at 220 grit. And at that grit, it's going to take a lot more effort to burn through that veneer. The other mistake that you can make with the veneer is scratching it up. Slide your sheet of plywood face down across a gritty workbench with old glue drips on them, or a garage floor with exactly one pebble on it, and you can mar that surface with a nice long scratch. If you're using a table saw to cut your parts and you remember from mistake number 1 to put your good show face up, then you can mostly avoid this issue. But if you're using a track saw or a circular saw, then your good face is facing down. So the best way to solve for this is to use that sheet of pink foam insulation that I talked about at the beginning of the video. You can get these 4x8 sheets at the home center pretty easily, and this foam not only gives your plywood a safe surface to sit on while you're cutting it up, but it also gives your saw blade somewhere to go when you're making the cuts. And of course, you could just throw this on the floor or a centipede like I'm doing here, or on your workbench. And that's how you're going to set yourself up to not make those mistakes that's going to ruin the most visible part of your plywood. So that is 5 ways to avoid ruining good plywood. And if you have further questions about plywood, like grades, cores, veneers, and where the good stuff hides, well, I made a video on all of that right here. Go and check that out, and until next time, have fun in the shop.